Hey, Pastor Steve Waldron. I hope you're having a great day in Jesus. We're going to be looking at the ancient historical evidence for Jesus. The evidence for Jesus. I'm getting this from a book I wrote in 2007, I think. The ancient historical evidence of Jesus, or for Jesus. Steve B. Waldron, that's me. And put out by Voice and Vision back in the day. And it's not currently in print. I'm going to hopefully be getting some reprinted in the future. As a matter of fact, by the time you see this video, it may be in print. But let's get started. I see all over the place, Jesus never existed. Jesus never existed. And that was kind of the impetus for writing this book, because even 15 years ago, people were saying, there's no evidence Jesus existed. So we're going to look, and it'll probably take more than one video. And so we've got a lot of things to cover. So let's get started. We're going to start off on page 3 of the book that I wrote. And it's Cornelius Tacitus. I'm going to read some, make some comments as we go. Again, thanks for being here. Do check out our other videos. Join us daily. Cornelius Tacitus, he lived from 55 to 120 AD and is considered to be the greatest ancient historian of Rome. And so in writing of the fire in Rome, which occurred in July 64 AD, he records the following. So we're looking, did Jesus exist? So Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. So Christians, so for there to be Christians, there had to be a Christ, Jesus the Christ, right? So Christus, from whom the name had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Now look at all the stuff that he's already admitted. There's Christus. That's where the name Christian gets its name from, Acts chapter 11. Suffered the extreme penalty. He was crucified during the reign of Tiberius. That's accurate. At the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So again, it broke out in Judea, the first source, and also in Rome. So Tacitus, in writing about this July 64 persecution by Nero, gives a ton of historical evidence of Jesus. And he was the Christ, and that it started in Judea, went to Rome. Paul's epistle to the Romans shows that, as well as many other things. There's early, even house churches, I think, in Rome from the mid-1st century AD, and several things. So Cornelius Tacitus, considered to be the greatest historian of ancient Rome, shows us that, yes, Jesus existed. But that's not all. And there's so many, you could go into the evidence for the resurrection, but we're going to try to go from stem to stern on this. And so this was written when Cornelius Tacitus wrote. He wrote this about 115 AD. And so I make a little comment in a paragraph. This is remarkable considering the two earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch more than 400 years after his death. Yet historians consider both of them to be trustworthy accounts of his life. Here we have an account by a reliable historian 85 or so years after the death of Jesus, giving valuable information about him. And so from the account, we're just going to recap this from the account. There was a group of people called Christians in 64 AD, which had their origins from Christus, Latin for Christ, who was killed during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. And so for anybody with even cursory knowledge of the Bible, you realize that these statements are exactingly accurate, and that the gospel first broke out in Judea, but later went even to Rome. This obviously harmonizes with the Bible. So Tacitus also makes reference to Christianity in his histories in a fragment preserved by Sulpicius Severus in his Chronicles 2:30 and 6. 2.30 16.6. Sulpicius Severus also says Tacitus made reference to Christianity. The first is from Tacitus Annals, 1544. I did want to give that. And so this was at least in the editions I was using way back in the day. So Suetonius is next. Suetonius, many of you know the lives of the 12 Caesars. So Suetonius is next. So next we come to Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, 69 to 140 AD is when he lived approximately, a court official under the Emperor Hadrian. And so in 112 AD, writing in his famous Life of the 12 Caesars, he also speaks at least once about Christians. And he records punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men addicted to a novel and mischievous superstition. And this is from the Life of Nero, 16.2, 16 and 2. In another reference, he writes, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Life of Claudius, 25 and 4. Now, a lot of people would say Chrestus, it was a slave rebellion and that type thing. I personally would think, I studied it a lot for a long time, it's referring to Jesus. But understand, people look for other explanations for things, so we understand that. But even that last phraseology, expelled them from Rome, this is strikingly reminiscent of Acts 18, 1 and 2, which records the Jews being expelled from Rome during the reign of Claudius. So the name Chrestus, while used in reference to Jesus, was also a common name of the time, and so historians are hesitant to state conclusively that the last reference is to Jesus. But remember, there was a reference before about Nero, but from the unmistakable first reference, we learn there was a group of people in 64 AD which were referred to as Christians, which had a novel, seeming to indicate rather new, superstition, meaning it was related to religion. So this obviously relates well with history and with Tacitus as well. And next one, the third one we'll look at today, is by Pliny the Younger and also the Emperor Trajan. And I remember the first time I read this, I was so shocked because I had studied this, I thought, fairly extensively, and somehow it had kind of slipped through the cracks of my learning, probably 18, 20 years ago at least. So let's get started on that. Pliny the Younger. So we've already seen that in the famous Life of the 12 Caesars, Suetonius talks about it. The most accurate, famous of the ancient historians, Tacitus, talks about Christians, by default, Jesus Christ. It's Pliny the Younger. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at who is Pliny the Younger and all this. Also in 112 AD, we have an imperial correspondence between Plinius Secundus, called Pliny the Younger, who was provincial governor of Pontus in Bithynia, and the Roman Emperor Trajan. Christians have been numerous in Pliny's jurisdiction, even to the point of whole towns and villages where the pagan temples were almost completely abandoned. Look at Acts 20 in Ephesus. But the Christians were considered lawbreakers, and they would not offer sacrifice to Caesar. That was kind of a unanimity. He was considered deity, so that's how they unified the empire. And this went on, like even in England, you had to be in the Church of England or you became a pilgrim to the United States or worse. So in that they would not offer sacrifice to Caesar in order to obtain the libellus, whereby they might buy and sell and be legal Roman citizens. They'd sprinkle incense to the image of the emperor, and then they would get a libellus that would allow them to enter the marketplace to buy and sell. So Pliny wanted to know how far he should go in eradicating Christianity, since so many people were involved with it. Because, whole towns and villages are closing down pagan temples because of that. So here's part of the correspondence. Those who denied that they had been Christians when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, he's writing to the emperor, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with statues of the gods, and moreover, cursed Christ's name, which those who are really Christians, it is said, can not be forced to do. So, they're not going to curse Christ's name. And so I thought they should be discharged. Okay, if they're willing to do sacrifice, curse Christ's name, they should be discharged. Others named by the informer, there was an informer here, declared that they were Christians but denied it. So some people were denying they were Christians, asserting that they had been but ceased to be some 3 years before. Others many years, some as much as 25 years before. They all worshipped your image and statues. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of a summation here. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were, and this is his writing to Trajan, they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn, because it was illegal, so they met in the morning before dawn, and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as God. I think that's so phenomenal. So they sang a hymn to Christ as God. Some translations say a God, mostly Christ as God. And to bind themselves by an oath. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and assemble again to partake of food. And this was either the agape love feast or communion. And this was in Pliny's letters 1096. So then Trajan, the emperor, writes back to Pliny, because he was, an official. So Trajan corresponding back, stating that the current course of action was fine, and that the Christians should not be hunted down, but subjected to punishment and found unless they recant. So here's the conclusion of Pliny. Again, this early attestation, only 80 years or so after the death of Jesus, and some would say very near the lifetime of the Apostle John, the death of Jesus, showing the widespread nature of Christianity, is historical truth as set forth by a secular authority. Now, next we come to something from archaeology, and they've actually, I think, found some more just recently, but this is an archaeological find from June 1968, and we're going to see how it relates to early Christianity and the evidence for Jesus. So in June of 1968, a body of a crucified Jew named Yohanan ben Ha-Galgol was found in Jerusalem in an ossuary, a burial box. His remains date to about 70 A.D. Yeah, you know what happened in 70 A.D., the destruction of Jerusalem. And he had been killed by crucifixion. Hebrew University pathologist Dr. N. Haas was able to determine the common Roman methods of crucifixion for this 24 to 28-year-old young man, this victim crucified by the Romans. A 7-inch nail remained in his heel, having been driven into olive wood. The crosses of olive wood. Here, nails were also driven between his radius and ulna bones in his arms, so not a bone of him was broken. His legs had been crushed as well. This coincides remarkably with the biblical narrative of the crucifixion. Not a bone of Jesus was broken during Jesus' crucifixion. However, the biblical narrative records that the two thieves who were crucified with Jesus had their legs crushed with the cuneiform, it was called, to induce a rapid death by suffocation. This again showing in vivid fine detail the authenticity of the crucifixion as a valid means of Roman execution, and is tremendous testimony to the accurate historical nature of Jesus Christ. So when we read about in Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and then of course in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then Paul preaches the cross everywhere, among others of the apostles. That book of Acts, 1 Corinthians, he determined know nothing among them except Christ him crucified. Well, in the first century, we know Romans were crucifying Jewish victims in the Jerusalem area. And even some fascinating things like a crushed leg that goes along with the two thieves Jesus was crucified with, and then the placement of the nails, confirming that not a bone of Jesus was broken. Now, the next one is something fascinating. It goes into the realm of textual criticism, and it's done by Karsten Thiede, and it's about early papyri. Now, let's see how early. Now, I do know mainstream textual criticism would say that it's not quite this early. I've done studies on Dead Sea Scroll discoveries from before 68 AD, and like the founder of the magazine Papyrology actually said that there were 9 New Testament fragments, and Dr. Bill Cooper from the United Kingdom, graduate, I think, of Cambridge and with creation science movement there, goes into that. But we're not going to go into those. Let's go into this. 3 early papyri. Recently, 3 ancient papyri were subjected to a process of examination under an epifluorescent confocal laser scanning microscope. These biblical papyri, containing portions from the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, by the way, the Matthean portion actually confirms the Textus Receptus. Who was the naval guy that Chuck Missler, that I enjoyed his teaching so much? He brings that out as well. Were shown by the scientific examination to be several decades older than previously thought. These papyri, designated as P4, P64, P67, were demonstrated as being written before 66 AD. So this again gives astounding attestation to the life and historicity of Jesus from 30 to 35 years after his crucifixion. So what they can do is they can tell when certain papyri and ink was used, because they don't just find biblical manuscripts, they find rental agreements and all kinds of stuff. And so things that are dated, you know the exact date. And so different manufacturing processes, pollen samples, all kinds of stuff in the papyrus and in the ink. And so you can kind of go to a more approximate time there. Now, probably the most famous of the evidences for Jesus in the 1st century AD is Flavius Josephus, who is considered a traitor in the Jewish nation. And so he was born somewhere around 37 AD and died probably just after 100 AD. You can read, Paul Meyer wrote an amazing book on him and his military ingenuity. So Josephus was a Jewish Levite who was favorable to Roman rule. He even participated in a trip to the city of Rome on an official matter. However, when war between the Jews and Romans could not be avoided, he became the ingenious commander of the Jewish army in the region of Galilee, and he was ingenious. He was later captured for this and its details. He's known to the Jews as a traitor, and he lived in a retirement where he wrote a history of the Jews. Writing about 90 to 95 AD, but now he would have been contemporaneous with Paul and the apostles and all this, he mentions Jesus quite at length. In this instance, he tells of the death of James, Jesus' half-brother, in 62 AD. So he, the high priest, assembled a council of the judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James, together with some others, and having accused them as lawbreakers, he delivered them to be stoned. That's in his Antiquities 9:1. So he makes reference to Jesus and said the so-called Christ. So, and also mentions James. He also mentions John the Baptist as he's writing and stuff too, which is kind of cool. But also in his Antiquities, we find this famous reference to Jesus. Now, some people feel that portions of this were interpolated by later Christian writers. I think that too. Others feel the entire passage is genuine. In deference to the probability that at least some of the more glowing references to Jesus in the standard edition of Josephus in the account were interpolated, we're going to look at an Arabic manuscript that many people think is very accurate. So at this time, this is Josephus, there was a man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Antiquities 18:33. A lot of early evidence for Jesus. Share with your friends. Put your faith in Jesus. Be born again. And we're going to go over some more. God bless. We love you. Bye-bye.